it's inspiriting to see this group, both particular group sitting in the first row, whose names you will hear about in a moment, but especially to see this turnout for this felicitous occasion. Columbia University is one of these special places that refuses a choice between deep scholarship and research and profound, effective, inclusive pedagogy. This isn't, I would say, you know, there are a lot of talk about first, second, third, fourth purposes of the university. It is the core purpose of the university to work with a word I'm now going to utter that I love. I once worked for a summer as a roofer, and not a good job, especially in the summer. If you work as a roofer, you learn the word imbricate. Imbricated tiles are overlapping like this, as opposed to valvated tiles, which sit side by side. In any event, the highest principle here is the imbrication of pedagogy and scholarship. And we are here devoted to that principle. The teaching and learning, we have, I'm just looking for the precise number, there have been 133 teaching and learning grants funded since 2014 by our teaching and learning grants program. And I want to encourage everyone here who's eligible to apply for teaching and learning grants. I asked for some of the subjects which have been covered and funded by this work. They include work on authentic materials to enhance language learning, creating collaborative course environment, Sharon, flipped classroom approaches, transforming instruction in science, and I could go on with a much longer list. And this annual celebration of Teaching and Learning Symposium celebrates, showcases, highlights awardees of the Provost Teaching and Learning RFPs. And it's really a privilege to be the Provost and help superintend this fantastic initiative. And then a word about the cohort of senior faculty teaching scholars. We receive nominations. Nominations are limited. And I underscore the word limited to senior faculty, who of course are outstanding teachers, but also are profound and important researchers. Back to the imbrication of, I don't want to compare you to tiles, but that's not quite right. I apologize for that. But the passion for communication about ideas, about research, about what matters in terms of understanding both nature and the human condition, the capacity to communicate and to have others learn as they hear that communication is so fundamental. And during the course of the year, the scholars, who I will ask to rise one at a time in just a moment, will help us. Will help us partner with CoT&L to develop a plan or plans for supporting, changing, innovating the culture of teaching and learning within the university. And now it's my great pleasure to identify and congratulate the second cohort of senior faculty teaching scholars. Are there any colleagues here from the first cohort? So raise your hand. Second cohort. It will be a requirement that you come back next year. I impose. It's a little footnote. The first class I ever taught was at the University of Chicago. I handed out my reading list, and up came a a hand and said, as you did there, you didn't call professor, but Mr. or Ms. Mr. Katznelson said to a student, a freshman, in taking his first class, I believe your list is incoherent. And I asked him why, and he gave me perfectly good reasons. So teaching is a form of back and forth communication. In any event, here are our wonderful senior faculty teaching scholars. Sharon Akabis. Thomas Grohl. David Wang. Eleanor Johnson. Helen Liu. Yosef Soret. Wei-Peng Wu. Tian Zhang. And our last awardee this year is Janice Cutler, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. A collective round of applause.
I'm Catherine Ross, the Executive Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. It is my great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michelle Miller, who is a professor of psychological sciences, the President's Distinguished Teaching Fellow at Northern Arizona University, and she is the author of Minds Online, Teaching Effectively with Technology. Dr. Miller works with faculty at NAU and other institutions to improve teaching practices and course designs, with an emphasis on evidence-based practices and innovative uses of technology. Today's keynote, Learning at the Intersection of Cognition, Motivation, and Technology, Fulfilling the Promise of Teaching with Technology, will explore how we can leverage cognitive and motivational research to create technology-enhanced learning activities that make the most of how our minds work. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Michelle Miller.
Thank you, and thank you so much for that introduction. And it is such an honor to be here today and to be a part of this event. And I would like to thank everybody who's here today for taking their time to engage with some of the ideas and connections that I'm going to put to you today. So, back in 2014, I did publish this book, Minds Online, Teaching with Technology. And the purpose of this book was to draw together what we know about the way in which human beings think, take in, and process information. Draw that together with the emergence of new kinds of educational technologies, especially those that were being used in all different kind of modalities of teaching, such as fully online, blended, hybrid, even your more traditional face-to-face courses that were enhancing with technologies of different kinds. And to write this book and to do that scholarship, of course, I was drawing on my background as a cognitive psychologist, a psychologist specializing in information processing and that aspect of the mind. But I was also drawing on a great deal of practical experience that I built up throughout the years working with students at different levels, different backgrounds, bringing to the table different kinds of preparation for their courses. And I was also bringing to bear a lot of experience in working with faculty at my institution, but also around the country. Faculty from across disciplines, but all engaged practitioners who were passionate scholar teachers who were pushing out into what remain some very new and innovative ways of teaching students and asking them what they saw as the challenges but also the opportunities that present us at this particular point in the history of higher education. So that's really pretty exciting work. But you can imagine, since I am a cognitive psychologist by training, that means that a lot of my early work was in really theoretical issues. So things like the ins and outs of how memory works, working memory, language, attention, those kinds of processes. And these days, most of my work is in much more practical and applied issues, really looking at and comparing among some different approaches to teaching. And those projects are important to me, and we'll actually touch on a few of them today as we have our time together. But no matter how kind of nuts and bolts and down to earth those projects are, they still come from this one particular framework that I will share with you in a little bit, the cognitive framework, looking at what is going on in the minds of the learners as we work with them. So that's my approach, and that's what's really driven all of that work with faculty, all of that work with students, and what I continue to look at today. So as we kind of engage with some of these ideas today, a couple of very practical points. We are going to have some time to stop out and have comments and feedback from you, the practitioners here, specifically about how some of these issues in teaching and learning with technology, have come into play with your students at Columbia specifically. And to do this, I would like to encourage everybody to definitely use the microphone. We have some runners here today who will make that possible. And this is first off for reasons of full inclusion, so that everybody here can access the comments as they're being said, and also to make life a little bit easier for those who are tasked with recording our session here today. So I would encourage you to do that. And I also want to tell you that I have put together this website, which you're welcome to visit now if you dare, but really at any point in the future. And this has a deeper dive into examples, supporting research, and more in-depth ideas that have to do with the techniques and approaches we'll talk about today. And I like to do this as well because I think it's important to provide people with some of the sources, with the claims that we make in talks like this. And that's a way to do this without having every slide turn into a tiny little references section. So that is there for you. So what do I mean when I say I take a cognitive approach, a cognitive framework, and present faculty with this? In talking about teaching and learning. Well, I've done three things in particular. So there's a vast amount of research at this point in the study of how people take in, process, and use information, right? And it's difficult even for those of us within the field to look at this and say, what's really relevant to the teaching and learning we're actually engaged with? So what I've come to settle on is this. So out of all that vast body of work, there's really three areas that float to the top as those that are the most germane to teaching and learning. So that's what I mean when I come at this from this framework. So looking at what specifically we mean by these different areas, attention, memory, and thinking. Well, attention, it's funny because when I sat down to write Minds Online, of course I looked at a lot of the other really great books and frameworks that are out there, right? And I was really surprised that even so many of the classics in the field, the psychology of learning, don't start with attention. And I say I'm surprised because as a cognitive psychologist, I know that in the last 20 years or so, we have learned a vast amount about how attention works in the mind and in the brain. And we kind of know at this point, too, that for practical purposes, if we're going to learn anything, if we're going to encode any new information, for practical purposes, attention has to be first on the scene. In fact, if we're going to solve problems, think, or do other interesting things in cognition, attention has to be there. So it kind of makes sense to think about how students' attention is captured and focused during learning. So that's one aspect of learning that flows directly from a cognitive psychologist perspective on teaching and learning. And then, of course, there's memory. All right, this is pretty much the bread and butter issue of anybody who does research in cognitive psychology, how we remember. And it's obviously very relevant to learning. We are talking about things like building a base of knowledge. However, big caveat here, this does not mean that I'm putting to you that memory or memorization is the sole aim or even the most important aim of teaching, right? So nobody I know who's serious about teaching and learning today, people who do things like come to teaching and learning conferences in the middle of the semester on an afternoon, nobody who's serious about teaching and learning in this way believes that anymore, all right? So we're not saying that. However, more of us who are in this serious about teaching and learning space are saying it's okay to expect students and to talk about students building and acquiring a base of knowledge as a key part of what we want them to be doing in our courses. That's all right. And we realize today as well that this doesn't necessarily have to be this either-or choice that I know that a lot of us, as we were coming up, we were presented with it that way, right? Do you want students to be able to think, or do you want students to remember what you're teaching them? Which one do you want? We want both. We need both. And contemporary cognitive research, furthermore, tells us that when you know more in an area, it actually supports your ability to think more like an expert in that area, which is great. And there's more good news, which is this. We now know a tremendous amount from applied memory research about how to commit more information to memory more quickly in less study time than ever before. So there's that aspect of learning. And then, of course, there is the higher thought processes. These are the things that those of us who are serious about teaching and learning, this is what we most want our students to get out of our courses, right? So if I think about what I want students in my, say, Introduction to Psychology course, what do I want them to have at the end of it? Well, of course, I want them to know about the landmark studies of our field. I want them to know about Ivan Pavlov and who he was, be able to identify some important terms. But what I want, if I have to choose, is I want them to think more like me at the end of that course. I want them to look at problems in behavior in the mind, using the habits of mind and the tools that look a little bit more like how I would do it, right? That's what I want. But just like so much in life, just wanting it really badly does not make it happen. So we also know now that development of thinking skills takes more practice, more concerted practice than it first appears at first glance. And this is especially true if we're talking about developing thinking skills that transfer into the next module, into the next course, into the next degree that the students might attempt for the rest of their lives. So that's what I mean when I say a cognitive framework can help us identify, all right, if I have an issue in teaching and learning, something that's not working or something that I want to make it work better, looking at it through this framework can help simplify and direct our efforts. And I think this is important because we do face a lot of choices as teachers, right? There are dozens, if not hundreds, of different techniques, different approaches, different learning activities we could build into any given course. And this helps us select from among them to say, well, you know, I'm really talking about that first stage where students have to pay attention, or I really have this higher order thinking skill that I don't think is quite clicking. That is helpful. And it's also helpful when we come to the question of selecting educational technologies. Because today we really do have an issue of choice with educational technologies. Just looking at commercial products alone, my inbox fills up every day with a new company, with a new tool that I definitely want to put in my courses, and this is going to solve my problems, right? So by taking a step back and saying, well, conceptually, what aspect of learning are we looking at, and how would this map onto that? That can help us in the mindful selection of technologies. And that's been the characteristic of a number of the things that I've written and worked on over the last 10 years or so. Making that connection to say, all right, technologies, how do they map onto these key aspects of learning? And that's important as well, because as I think we all know by now, technologies do absolutely nothing to promote learning by their mere presence, right? I think we are all well past that naive stage where the field sort of started out of, hey, we'll wheel the table full of iPads into the classroom and magic will happen. We now know it is a lot more complicated than that, if only that were true. So you can't buy the connection to learning, but you can develop it in this way. And if you talk to pretty much any expert today on educational technology, they will tell you some variation of the same thing. You need to have your goals in mind, your learning goals in mind, before you start dropping technologies into a course, whether it's face-to-face, online, or somewhere in between. So that is this framework that I've been working on, the cognitive framework. But as I got deeper into developing this and articulating it for faculty across disciplines, I realized there was something missing. And I mean this very literally. I was about 2/3 of the way through writing Minds Online and realized that the section that I wanted to put after, I'd finished talking about memory and attention and thinking and all this was not what I needed. And it wasn't working. And I had some frantic late night emails to my editor saying, I don't know what I'm going to do. And then it hit me. I needed to be talking about what we could very broadly term motivation. I needed to be talking about motivating students to actually do these wonderful technology-enhanced learning activities that we had set up for them, right? And this was a scary thought because as an academic, I like to stay in my lane, right? Motivation isn't my area. I'm a cognitive psychologist. But I took the breath, I went back to some of the classic research, and I put that section in the book. And I'm glad I did, because right now, we've really come full circle. As I go out and talk to faculty again about how they're engaging students, the issues and triumphs that they're having in their classrooms, this is what they're talking about. They're saying, what I'm really looking at is how to elicit from students the productive effort that is the basis for all learning, right? Productive effort that is the basis for all learning. And this is something that I really believe, and I would bet that many of you believe it as well, with the emphasis on productive, right? So eliciting from students this productive effort and directing those efforts in ways that we know are likely to pay off in these different aspects of learning based on the research that's out there, that's what we're going to be talking about today. How those two sides can come together, how they can complement each other sometimes, how they need each other to work, and what that tells us about how to select from and develop from among the array of different options we have for bringing technology into our courses. So when we talk about motivation, I say that is a really, really broad term. And so I like to kind of funnel this and think about it in a more specific way. And so I want to, for some of you, this will be an introduction to this term, but the term itself is almost self-explanatory. Self-regulated learning. So there's quite a few definitions of this out there. I've provided one that I particularly like from Linda Nilsson, who's written quite a few very practical books on teaching and learning in college. So the conscious planning, monitoring, so that's self-awareness, monitoring, evaluation, how am I doing, and ultimately control over one's learning. So that's kind of the state that we want to attain in our students, self-regulated learning. And it's funneling down a little bit more specific than just saying, hey, the student is motivated or they're not motivated. So here's where I'd like to hear from you, see if we can get a few comments. And here's my question to you. With this idea of self-regulated learning, what does that look like in your courses that you teach in your discipline? So let's get a few examples. What does self-regulated learning look like in your courses? What does that actually physically look like when a student is engaged in self-regulated learning? And we have in the front, and can we get a mic? Here we go.
In my personal opinion, learners or students, they need to learn by themselves, but under some good planning, and those good planning could be based on teachers and students. So if they can collaborate, do something together, and it's something like students don't feel they are monitored, but actually someone is still like evaluate them or observe their behaviors, so that when they do something not on the right track, they still could be guided, then go back to the right path.
Okay, all right. So without the presence of the teacher actually there to say, okay, you do this and you do this, taking that on for themselves and doing it collaboratively. And that's important in your specific discipline and field, the ability to collaborate meaningfully and to take that from the teacher and to take it onto themselves. All right, that's one way in one person's discipline and course that it can look. And we have another.
So the course I teach involves a seminar style, and students are responsible for doing the presentation and encouraged to do a presentation in a creative way. So when we talk to them about it, we ask them to create a presentation, 20 minutes or so, for the rest of the class that they would want for themselves. So that's where it becomes. So we really encourage them to think about, as they're learning the material and learning and thinking about presenting it to the other students, we ask them to really think about how would they like this material presented to them, and then they do that, and then they get feedback not only on the content, but on that very fact of having how well they matched that directive.
Can I ask what discipline are you teaching in?
I teach psychiatry.
Psychiatry, okay, all right. So a presentation that, now you're off the stage and okay, you get to try it, teach it, present it, and that's part of the evaluation. Wonderful, and we have another hand.
So just to add on to that, I started with where this ended, ultimately control one's learning, which is, I see the first step is making students want to learn about whatever you're teaching for themselves, not because it's a class, not because it's required or they need the credits or whatever, that they are doing it because they want to do it. And then I think the rest of it, the planning, monitoring, evaluating their learning, and putting, what you said before about thinking, putting together that critical thinking and making the connections comes easily.
Okay, all right. So starting with why?
Yes.
All right, so why are we learning it? And then then it falls out from that or becomes easier to make that change of, all right, now what are you going to do to take over this learning process? All right, great. So it's always good to kind of make these things concrete, of course, and to contextualize them within our disciplines. So that's how that can look. And I would also put to you that this is a particularly pressing problem today. Now, of course, student motivation and students putting in productive effort is probably something that teachers have been talking about since the first student and teacher walked this earth. However, I think that this is something that is more pressing today for a couple of different reasons. I don't believe in the concept of digital natives or that students today are somehow fundamentally wired differently from growing up in an age of social media or anything like that. There's not a whole lot of good evidence for that. However, I think there are some other reasons. But here again is where I would like to put this to the group, presuming that at least some of you agree with this claim, that today, productive student effort, student motivation, self-regulation, these are more important today. Let me see if some of you have some ideas about why this might be the case. And we have a hand right here.
The course of decades, I've concluded there are so many distractions now that did not exist decades ago, and it has gradually grown and grown. And with that, how do you learn how to pay attention, and then how do you learn how to keep paying attention? I think it's much harder.
Okay, right. So distractions, I mean, everything from the ping, did you get my text? Did you get my text that's coming in as we're trying to engage in, say, a seminar, to larger distractions, concerns for the future. Perhaps I'm helping support my family back home while I'm in school. All of those. So distraction is a broad term for other things that are competing. All right, that's one reason. Other reasons, yes?
Hi. the imperative to become a lifelong learner?
Right. The future's going to belong to people who can do that. I mean, really. Who can teach themselves, and teach themselves in a variety of different modalities as well. That is imperative. So with perhaps more rapid changes in different fields, in how information is distributed, that is what I need to walk out of here with, no matter where I'm getting my degree or what I'm getting my degree in. All right, 2 very good reasons. Now, oh, and we have another contribution.
Side, there's so much access to more information now than existed before that to the extent that a student can spend effort and self-regulate, the opportunity is limitless.
Right. The other side of there's too much, the distraction, there's pressure on me to teach myself, but I can. I mean, I think, for example, a project that I helped with a while back, a state was converting its small business administration materials that had been taught out of the local community college to online. So if I'm running my business and I want to learn about how to to pass my business on to my kids or do credit checks, I used to go and physically show up at the community college and be taught, and now it's there for me. I can do it anytime, the access is broader, but it's on me to do that. Right, so this is the kind of environment we're talking about. And definitely as we do have more courses, nationwide, worldwide, going fully online, I mean, while fully online instruction, if it's done right, it's not a teach yourself kind of situation. However, I think we all know that there's definitely an out of sight, out of mind problem when we're doing work online. We can just leave the laptop closed and procrastinate what we're supposed to be doing. And once we're there in our online course, well, we're there coexisting with an ecosystem that is designed to spirit us away onto social media and everything else. So these are all good reasons to really put this at the forefront of the work that we're all doing. And here's another reason that's really closely linked to our last comment, actually, which is that we do know more about learning than ever before. We know more about things like the most efficient ways to study or how to develop transferable problem-solving and thinking skills. But all of that may as well just sit figuratively, at least in a library, if students won't engage themselves in it and if we lack some of the ways to engage them in it. So to take advantage of all this work that's been done is a giant missed opportunity if we don't have this as part of the mix. So here's a case in point. A bit of an extended example that I think is really well grounded in research and highly relevant to a lot of the work we're doing. And so I'll share it with you. This is the case of retrieval practice and what's known as the testing effect. Now, I always take the opportunity to do this when I speak with faculty audiences, which is to ask for, the classic show of hands. How many people feel that they have at least some familiarity with these concepts of retrieval practice or the testing effect? Retrieval practice, testing effect. Beautiful. All right, so about half the room. And when I started speaking with faculty about these issues probably 12 to 15 years ago, I'll guarantee you that maybe 2 hands went up, and they were probably the instructional designers who were in the back of the room helping with the event. So it's beautiful that this has really flowed out into the consciousness of so many of us who work in teaching and learning. Now, for those who can use an introduction or a refresher very briefly, retrieval practice refers to effortfully pulling information out of memory. Right? So anytime we have to kind of think back and not refer to something, but think back and say, do I remember this information? We're engaged in retrieval practice. And it produces something called the testing effect, which is that engaging in that particular way of processing information increases your likelihood of remembering it better than anything else you can do with the time. And that is a big claim, and I feel we can all back it up. All right, so retrieval practice is powerful. And you can try it for yourself in a small way in your own life. If you're, always looking for that like little security code on the back of your credit card, right? Try not looking one time and just try typing it in without actually looking at it. And you'll find that after a few trials, you will actually remember that number much more so than if you keep flipping it over and looking every single time. So retrieval practice and the testing effect It's not complicated. It's perhaps not that glamorous. It relates just to establishing memory and a base of knowledge. But wow, this is a very powerful piece of information that we can build into our courses and that can guide our choice of technologies. Now, I do want to assure you, as much as I can, that this is not just one study that one group did one time and maybe they found it in this one laboratory contrived situation. This has been tried with realistic materials across long retention intervals, lots of different test formats. It's very, very robust. Something like this effect obtains across all these different kinds of conditions. And we're talking about a long line of research, not just 1, 2, or 3 studies. And I can cite a tremendous number of them. And of course, on my website that I put together, there's quite a few you can get into if you want. This is just one example that was published a while ago, a review of all the different ways that this has been documented and pushed to its limits, the testing effect. And in particular, when you put it in a head-to-head test against restudying or reviewing, it blows that out of the water. And that's important because guess what the default is for many of our students? When they say, I'm going home and I'm going to study for 3 hours, oftentimes we're talking about the highlighter rainbow parade of, all right, I looked at it, I looked at it, I looked at it. And, you know, while going back to a text and reading it deeply again or annotating, that's obviously very helpful. This highlighter parade is not from a memory standpoint. So students left to their own devices will do this, but we know what's powerful and what uses the time well is retrieval practice. So things like self-quizzing. And we even find in some more of the recent research on it that, you know, once again, it's not a trade-off between doing this or developing your ability to think in an area. Absolutely the opposite. So here's just one example of a very recent study that came out looking at how when students do more retrieval practice with information, we can see the development of some aspects of their thinking skills. And they were able to kind of pinpoint this in some laboratory procedures. So things like learning to draw inferences or say whether some new item could be a member of a category. Those are a little obscure, but they do relate to thinking. And they make that link that when you know more about an area, you think more like an expert in that area. What helps you know more? Retrieval practice. What a connection. So retrieval practice is this incredible success story. We've gotten the word out, it's applicable, it works across disciplines, different levels of students, that's wonderful. It's even got its own website if you'd like to see a whole, even more research and different ideas for how to bring this into classes. That's fantastic. But of course, the catch is getting students to do the retrieval practice. And so we do still have that students will default to rereading. We know retrieval practice works. And it can be sometimes a tough sell to get them to do this. So here too, let's have a few examples. Why do you think this could be? Why do you think this is? That students will restudy when retrieval practice is what will really use their time better from a memory standpoint. Why do you think this happens? We have a hand right there.
So at least with my experience, one of the biggest issues that students have is like facing the frustration that ignorance can produce. So these active learning activities is constantly facing them with our natural ignorance as human beings. And that's something that many of them like struggle facing. While if you are rereading or redoing something that you did before, you're not facing it so directly.
All right, did we all get that? Because I think you nailed it. A somewhat complex but really important psychological process that's going on. And so exactly, when I'm testing myself, it becomes very, very obvious the pieces I didn't know, what I don't like. Maybe I feel uncomfortable. I feel uncomfortable about being faced with that. So we have that. It might undermine my confidence as a student, and I might subtly want to shy away from that. When I'm rereading, by contrast, I will probably gravitate to the parts of the text that I feel that I do understand and that I know a little bit better, right? And I might not realize I'm doing it. I might have great intentions as a student when I sit down. However, I'm going to get caught in this trap. And then when I go sit for, let's say, a higher stakes exam, that's exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to see all those pieces that I didn't understand before. So that's a great idea. Yes, do we have another?
I don't think students always know how to shape an activity that causes them to use effort for recall. They don't know how to take that material and turn it into an exercise that they can use to practice retrieval.
All right, so they simply don't know, and perhaps they don't, first of all, know that it's a good idea, or realize that it's going to pay off. And when I do, I'm not really quite sure. Maybe I'm used to the teacher setting that up for me. Right, so there are these barriers, and what do you know? They come back to some things that relate to self-regulated learning. So getting students to engage in retrieval practice, I think, is an important part of our course planning process, building in those opportunities, and also saying, how am I going to, whether it's incentives, encouragement, or just information, you know, why do we have so many quizzes in this course, that type of thing, that's what we need to be looking at. So I'm going to offer to you one simple but still research-grounded idea coming out of the psychology of motivation for how we can keep students moving forward with frequent assessments. So this one is one that starts with us, granted, and it's just this: early and often, fast and frequent. So in the national kind of teaching and learning space, what's come to be understood as really a best practice these days is getting away from the kind of 2 midterms and a final course design that many of us, we may have thrived with that. However, from a motivation standpoint, as well as a retrieval practice standpoint, it makes sense to break those down, maybe not get rid of them entirely, but precede them, share the space and time with frequent formative assessments, right? And I say that this is grounded in some very basic motivational research. We know that, for example, feedback, frequent feedback, helps us move forward. That's one of the things that gets individuals to expend effort and engage in a situation. If you think about it, video games, if you had to play Call of Duty for 2 months and then see how you were doing, nobody would play. It's that immediate feedback that helps keep us engaged in that game. So early and often, fast and frequent. It also taps into something called self-efficacy. All right, and this is an old, Psychology 101 textbook principle, but it's held up. It's essentially, if I see the impact of what I'm doing, I do an action, here's what happened, then that tends to motivate me. And that's because it's not just wanting a goal very badly that gets people involved in expending effort. It's feeling like, hey, what I'm doing is actually moving me in that direction. So I do something, I get feedback back. Even when the feedback isn't good, even when I took, say, a small stakes quiz and my grade wasn't perfect, that is still feedback that can help me engage. Now, I want to be real clear here that this is not motivation in the sense of what inspires me to be a part of this discipline, all right? The theme that came up before, the why. This is not that. This does not have to supplant that. But it also isn't just giving students grades as motivation. Think of it more as feedback, more as progress. Think of it as opportunities to encourage. And you see what the philosophy really is about. So that's motivation in one sense. In fact, the initiative that I helped create at my home institution, we believe in this so strongly, this early and often, fast and frequent principle, that we required it in this course design, redesign program that we've run for years. So we even set a kind of an arbitrary limit that you have to have some kind of graded work, some kind of activity that students get feedback on in the first 2 weeks of class. First 2 weeks of class. And many of our courses actually beat that. They'll have students come in and do some pre-assessment on the very first day. And that sets a tone for students that, we're not here to scare you or overstress you, but we hit the ground running in this course. A lot is going on. You're not going to have these long stretches where you're not quite sure how you're doing, and maybe you'll invest effort somewhere else. So that's one. Now, especially when this is done with technologies, the effects can be, I think, really, really powerful. And I want to share with you one of the projects out there, a research project that is one of my absolute favorites for demonstrating the power of redesigning a course around this idea. So this was carried out by James Pennebaker and his colleagues at the University of Texas in the context of, think the very vast introduction to psychology, huge class. Traditionally, there were just a few high-stakes exams, and that's where grade came from. Well, they replaced those completely with a daily quiz. Now, they had a special technology where students came in, you got a tablet, and they had a special quizzing platform. That probably wasn't as important. There's probably lots of ways to do this. But what was important was what students encountered with that technology every day. And it was an 8-question quiz. Here's your quiz on the concepts. And if you got something wrong, you personally got something wrong, that question showed back up on a quiz in the future. And so my grade is building up, my feedback is building up every single day. And they did show that, of course, grades are better with something like that. And they did have some ways of teasing apart. It wasn't just moving points from one thing to another. The students really were retaining more information. But most importantly was who was taking home a better grade and more learning. And it was students in particular who came from less advantaged backgrounds. So backgrounds, lower SES, probably poorer quality of high schools that they came from. These students were seeing tremendous increases, and other students weren't being brought down by it. And I think that's something that really makes me sit up and take notice when I think about the inequities that exist in my classrooms. And here's another amazing finding. They found that these improvements actually carried over to later classes that had nothing to do with psychology. And you kind of go, well, how is that possible? Well, they questioned students to kind of follow up on this surprising finding, and here's what they found. Students told them, well, I saw this in action. First it was a pain. I had to study and read my textbook every day before class. But then I saw how that made everything easier. Everything stuck. I understood what was going on. I never had to cram. So I said, no, I'm going to do this from now on, no matter how the class is set up. And that, I feel, is handing over self-regulated learning through a very simple mechanism to our students. And of course, the technologies now make this very easy. Now, this effect has been known about since I was in grad school, but we didn't have any really good, easy ways to have these retrieval practice opportunities. But we definitely do now, and these are just some little visual placeholders, not to worry about reading them or anything. But even simple things like Quizlet for students to quiz themselves, or Kahoot. Has anybody here heard of or used Kahoot? Awesome. It does one thing. It does it very, very well. It gives gamified in-class quizzes. I do these before exams because you can tell right away, okay, which questions and concepts are we having difficulty with. You can even get dedicated hardware to do in-class clickers. You see a picture right there of the iClicker system. In case you don't want the phones out in class, you can actually have a different kind of hardware for students to weigh in during the lecture, poll everywhere, or even the lowly learning management system. So a long time ago, we started dumping the whole publisher's test bank into our learning management system for Introduction to Psychology, and turning that into these repeatable small stakes quizzes that students had to do every week before we covered that material in class. And they would just keep their highest grade. And we would say, well, why, this is weird. Why would we set up a test like this? Well, let me tell you about a little thing called retrieval practice. So these are the things that make it much, much easier than it ever has been before to have students engaging with material frequently and engaging in a way that steers them away from merely reviewing information. And, in a way, it also taps into a concept that maybe is a little bit closer to that higher idea of motivation, and that is the transparency concept. So transparency is an idea that's starting to really develop in teaching and learning circles. And there's some exciting findings in particular for first-generation students, historically excluded and underrepresented students, and students who do come in with less preparation. So transparency, as the name implies, is a philosophy and an approach that emphasizes revealing to students, why are these assignments set up the way they are? You know, why do we have a quiz every week instead of just a midterm? And sharing that with students really as our allies and our partners in learning. When we do this, this does result in better performance, especially for the demographics of students that I mentioned. So explaining to students why, and also connecting material to the real world. So this is also part of transparency and does get to the why. So, you know, why is it that we care about the principles that were revealed by Ivan Pavlov in all of his famous studies? How might that actually help people in the world today? So, drawing on those, we can start to move students and tap into that motivation. Now, at this point as well, let's pivot to those thinking skills, all right? And what we know about those, developing higher order skills with an eye to both the cognitive and the motivational. And here, I think what's really exciting and what it continues to develop is the idea of using technology and innovative approaches of all kinds to promote the kind of practice of skills that we want students to have and to be able to transfer into their later career and later courses. So promoting practice. And one of the most compelling ways to do this, I think, is through simulations, all right? So saying, here's something we want students to be able to do. Let's have a way of simulating that, either using technology or doing it in person, and having them go through that. Now, let's get some examples from the group. Defining this very broadly, simulations, it can be case studies, role-playing, you name it. How many individuals, or who might be willing to share how they're doing this in their own classroom right now? So who's doing anything we could possibly classify as simulation, and who would like to share an example? And we have one.
Actually, tonight in my class, my students are studying what is qualitative design of research. It's a research methods class. And we will have like a panel, and the panel will be discussing a particular question, and the rest of the class will be observers to collect data and then discuss the whole process.
Okay, so we're going to run an in-person simulation tonight. Love it, all right. Doesn't have to be technology, but they're going through this activity. All right, good example. Who's got another? Do we have another example of a case study, a role play, a simulation? Here we have in the back.
I teach in an entry-level physical therapy program up at the medical school, and there's the class that my students are enrolled in is where they're learning about the variables that affect practice and learning. So I've actually taken a bunch of patient cases that they're learning in another class about procedural techniques, and I asked them to take one of the variables that we've learned and actually demonstrate it.
Okay, all right.
In a small group.
Okay, so physical therapy, did I get that right? Okay, so demonstrating how that plays out in a small group. All right, so I want to put to you, here's another claim for you, that in many ways, simulations for learning can be better than the real thing, right? So for example, working with a simulation of an animal training situation in psychology, or working with a client could actually be better for learning than working with a real animal or a real client. Big claim, but why do you think this might be? If you agree with this idea, that simulations have a lot of advantages, even over if we could put students in the real world right away and have them do these things, they're even better. So what do you think? We have one. How might it be better? Yes, thank you.
It provides them with a safe space to fail.
Safe space to fail. Yeah, well put, and a memorable phrase. Safe space to fail, right? And again, kind of connecting back to games and why games draw us in. Isn't that one of the reasons? I can fail, I can die, and I can try again, right? And believe me, I do within seconds of trying any game. All right, so there's one idea, safe space to fail. I think do we have another?
Maybe this is a saying too, reflect and redirect.
Reflect and redirect, right. So I failed. Maybe I'm not just going to say, well, let's do that again, but I'm going to reflect and say, well, wait a minute. Maybe that interaction with this therapist with the client didn't go the way I wanted. Let's reset and retry and look back at it, right? You can read about it in a textbook, but you have a much more receptive window when you tried and you failed. All right, did we have another? Yes, we have another.
I teach healthcare workers, and one of the things we focus on is rare events, which can be life-threatening. So we can simulate life-threatening events, and we can also control and manipulate them, and they can be dynamic over time.
All right. So control, manipulation, and setting up a situation that you may not run into for a long time, even out there in your career, but you need to be prepared, right? So all really good reasons. I mean, tacking onto a few of these, sometimes simulations can make the invisible visible, right? So if I'm working with, say, or teaching a physical process, I'm teaching, say, physics or chemistry, you can't see those in action. They're too fast, they're too small. I can do things that are dangerous. I can virtually go in a simulation and walk around on the inside of a volcano or in an active disease zone or something like that. I can do things that are simply expensive or unwieldy to do. So lots of good reasons why simulations are an exciting teaching technique, and they're another one where I think technology can marry that principle together with activities that are compelling to students. They do have the realism that carry them along and engage them in this effortful process of practice, which is the only way we're going to develop these higher level skills. So to give just, again, a few visual examples. Now, when I have looked at simulations that are out there for teaching and learning in college, what really strikes me is that so many of them are discipline specific. So I don't think you're going to go out there and find like the thing that helps you simulate whatever thinking skill. And it does mean that for you as a teacher, if you're looking to incorporate some of these, the best place to start is, well, first clarifying what it is, what is the skill that you want students to learn, but then going out from your discipline-specific perspective and saying, well, what really targets this? So some examples of how this can look. I know in my discipline, there's Sniffy the Rat. So how many people have ever seen or heard of Sniffy the Rat? I don't know if we have many. Okay, we have one diehard in the house who has seen Sniffy the Rat. So Sniffy is, as you might imagine, he's depicted here. He's in this training cage, a Skinner box with a little food hopper, and you can reward him and get him to do different things. Well, you know, when I and many other psychologists were coming up in our fields, you had to go to an actual rodent lab to do this. And so with this, you can shape Sniffy's behavior, take these very abstract, very dry things you're reading about in the textbook, the learning principles, and see them play out with this animated simulation. Now, it's not just a cartoon. It really does run on the same exact principles done very systematically that a live rat would do. But, you know, besides smelling a whole lot better than a real rodent lab and never biting you, he's also got a few other advantages. So now there's also what's called a mind window that shows what's actually developing in Sniffy's mind as he learns to stand on his hind legs or run around in a circle in the cage. Something like that, that teaches something that's notoriously difficult to engage students in psychology classrooms. CogLab, this is one that I've used in my courses for a long time, and it tackles the problem that students have a hard time making a mental leap when you're teaching cognitive psychology between these classic experimental paradigms, these landmark studies, and the theories about the mind that we develop as a result of those. So, you know, I can memorize the theory of working memory, and I can try to figure out what was this study that Alan Badley did, but I don't see the connection between those. So CogLab runs a variation of those landmark experimental paradigms on the student's own computer. They look at it from the participant's perspective. And so they actually physically see, this is what they meant when they talked about the word lists or things that showed up in different colors. You can gather the data and have them analyze the data as well, which is another skill that is very difficult to develop in our students. So those are some examples. Outside of psychology, this is a project that's been going on for a while at UC Boulder to have small, freely available, just very simple, interactive demonstrations that students can do to teach some basic principles in chemistry and biology, and physics as well. Now, if you want to look at some of the highest tech options out there for running educational simulations, well, of course, there's virtual reality, right? And it seems that every school that I visit these days, somebody has got at least one project to look at virtual reality and applying that to various problems in learning. So a lot is going on in this space right now, and I think we're still figuring out what are some of the principles and limitations. But I've been able to work with our immersive virtual reality laboratory at my institution as well, and have seen the power of this for targeted simulations of things that can be very, very difficult to teach. In this case, organic chemistry. So as you probably know, this is a big bottleneck course for many students. If they don't succeed, they don't go on in health professions. They don't go on in medical school. They don't go on to get that degree. So we really do need some tools for making some very, very complex abstract concepts as concrete as possible and giving them some opportunities to practice those, and in this case, in virtual space. So just briefly, here's what we have found as some of the key practices and some early preliminary findings that we're working on disseminating right now. So with our project, some of the things that we thought were very important is, first of all, collaborating very closely with the chemistry professor who we wanted to incorporate these as part of his course. So this can't be done in a vacuum of let's make some molecules and we'll make a space and students will come and kind of play with the molecules. It doesn't work that way. Our professor put together a series of structured activities. So here's what you're supposed to accomplish in this virtual environment. And it goes along with what we're actually learning in class. Well, when you incorporate virtual reality simulations in this way, here's what we're finding. So when we randomly assigned one section to have access to this instead of a different extra credit opportunity, of course we did find that the grade distribution actually improved for the section that had access to VR. You're more likely to earn an A or a B in organic chemistry when this is part of it. That's very exciting. But get this, we're finding that this pattern of better grades, better performance is far more pronounced and is consistently statistically reliable for first-generation students only. So this particular demographic of students in particular benefits from this compelling interactive way of mastering the material. And believe me, we are still diving into why did this happen and how can we explain this effect? But it may have to do with coming in with a somewhat weaker background, less access to high quality chemistry instruction before you got to college. It may have to do with how you see the instructor after they've provided this compelling simulation for you. That may be part of it as well. So this is a kind of a stay tuned, but that's like the highest tech, highest example of simulations in action. But I also want to share with you my favorite low tech example of an educational simulation. And it uses a technology that we don't even think of as technology anymore, but technically is, which is email. So this activity was shared with me by my colleague, Rebecca Mishter, who teaches art and web design at SUNY Oswego, a tremendously creative and engaged instructor. So here's what she does in her course for web media. So, of course, what students are having to do in this course, the goal of it, the skill that's being developed, is being able to create websites that look really good, work really well, and meet the needs of individual clients. And that's what they're going to have to do after they graduate, right? And so, quite naturally, she has an assignment where you pretend to develop a website for a client, and that's not that unusual. But here's the kicker, is when she gives students their assignments to create something for a simulated client, these clients don't just have requirements. They don't just have characteristics like, well, she sells honey and she's a for-profit or nonprofit. These clients also have personas. So I'm going to be interacting not with Professor Mushter, but what she does, as a touch of amazing realism, she creates email addresses for each of these clients. So I'm not writing and sending my work to you, Professor Mushter. I'm sending it to busybeelady42@gmail. And just that one tweak changes the tone of the whole assignment. So now we're simulating sending BusyBee42 our rough mock-up or our little wireframe that we did, and they all do have personas. She says she actually keeps pictures over her desk so she can respond in the way that that particular client would. And she'll write to them, and clients are not always clear, right? That's the skill. That's reality. And she says that the realism is enough to where every now and again a student will come to her and say, oh, my client is being totally unreasonable. And she has to remind them, that's me, on the other end of BusyBee42. And like any good simulation, it is a safe space to fail. So if I really blow it in my email exchange with BusyBeeLady, she can write back as herself and say, let's try that one again. So a simulation can really, it can run the gamut from virtual reality to something you put together with email. But they have those core qualities. They draw students in, they're realistic in the ways that map onto the important aspects of the task, they're repeatable, and they make the invisible visible sometimes. So we're going to, in our last piece of time here today, consider these three intersecting areas, very practical areas, to pick back up on this idea of supporting students in developing the knowledge, the skills, the ability to direct their own learning, to address things like distraction, and to make them those lifelong learners that we need them to be. So here's three that I'll put to you. So first off, I think that all of us can teach students, no matter what our expertise, our background, our type of course is, all of us can take on part of the task of teaching students about memory and about their own learning. Not through just generic study tips and make a schedule and those kinds of things they may have heard since high school, but specific research-based things like retrieval practice or other particular skills that we know that they're going to need in this given discipline. For example, collaboration. So memory is one that we can target with our students. And if you go to a website such as thelearningscientist.org or any of the others that I have in my website, there are, again, lots of materials you can share with students, everything from infographics to tip sheets that you can bring in, so you are sharing with them the best and most research-based ways to maximize their own memory. So if we are going to accept that memory is part of learning, that's not a bad thing, but let's be efficient about it. We can all do this. We've even, at my institution, we've even experimented with putting together a whole online course about memory that is not the same memory course you get from the Department of Psychology that's theory-based. It's about how to make your memory work for you. When I put that together, we used the great book Moonwalking with Einstein as a textbook. So those are some things we can draw on across disciplines. And then there's also this very, very important issue, teaching students about attention and distraction, but doing this in particular ways. I really firmly believe that standing in front of students and saying, you kids just need to get rid of your phones and it's terrible, especially if we're on our own phones at the same time, this is not an effective way to go about this. So here too, we can draw on the research, but meet students where they're at, and in a way that we're talking to them almost peer-to-peer and encouraging them to talk to each other rather than just lecturing them. But this is absolutely critical. If there's one 21st century cognitive skill that we're going to need for the immediate future, it's the ability to manage our own attention in this environment. Now, we've really taken this on at my institution in some depth, and in particular through this project called Attention Matters. And I'll say right off the top, this was all created as shareable open resources. So if there's any piece of this or part of this that you want, it is yours for the taking. Just contact me and I'll share this with you. But what we put together was actually a freestanding course. And it's online, fully online. It works a lot like a massive open online course or MOOC. It's just specific only to our institution. And we created it after I was going around doing this very inefficient sort of road show where people would say, oh, can you come talk to my students about how attention works and how you can't learn if you're distracted? And I would go as a one-off and try to do this. We said, let's put this all online. And now we have around 800 to 1,200 students a year go through this, and it's been running for years. So that's quite a few students we've reached. How do we do it? Well, our faculty, particularly faculty in STEM areas, are very willing to give a small amount of extra credit for completing this. They don't have to teach it. They don't have to take time out of the course schedule. They just have to give the link. I take care of the whole module. Students get a certificate of completion. They get extra credit points. And they've gone through this 1 to 2 hour mini course that talks about, in a very non-academic way, there's not a whole lot of readings, about these issues. In particular, some of the things we do is we have videos that I've curated online, so I know their quality, that illustrate things like, for example, change blindness, if you've ever heard of that, where you don't notice something once your attention is momentarily distracted. That's wonderful, and what it really is a jumping off point for students to be in online discussions that talk about their own attention and talk about how to create a plan for resisting that in their own lives. One of the things that we do as well is when they enter the Attention Matters module, we actually administer a survey too. And you'll see here that we're actually sneaking in a few things that don't, strictly speaking, have to do with attention, but do have to do with aspects of memory and efficient studying. So we ask them questions like these. Do you think you can effectively pay attention to several things? Do you think that memory works like a video recorder? Do you think rereading is a great way to learn? Do you think you can learn by osmosis? Yes, it's a classic folk belief that, I can be back here, I'll be doing my homework in my other class, texting 5 friends, and if my OChem professor says something important, I'll just magically tune back in. That is not how it works. So we asked students these, and we didn't call them attention myths, we call them counterproductive beliefs because we're not going to quibble about are they true for anybody on this whole planet. They might be. But we think that if you believe these things, you are more likely to tolerate distracting yourself in class, to text during class, and to engage in inefficient ways of studying. And we have found through having so many students come through this course that these counterproductive beliefs actually do go down, and pretty dramatically, just as a function of this 1 to 2 hour module. So these are beliefs that, entrenched though they may be, are changeable, and they're changeable with a relatively short intervention. And we also have found that, while we're not looking at the real world behaviors, we have not gone around and observed students who've been through this in class, we have found that self-reported multitasking behaviors, things like texting in class or doing off-topic email in class, those do predict responses on this survey, especially those that do specifically have to do with attention. So we feel reasonably confident there is a connection between what you think is true about your own attentional capacity and what you choose to do. But we don't just stop there with Attention Matters. The last piece of Attention Matters, again, fills that same gap that I ran across when I was writing Minds Online, which is what about the motivation? I can make a resolution and say, after talking to my peers in these groups and seeing what they present in this module, I'm going to turn off my phone and keep it in my backpack during my OChem class from now on. You can say that, and then what happens when class gets slow and you get that little itching in your fingers, right? So we also teach students some very basic things about how to engage in intentional behavior change. And this is another area that we know a tremendous amount about from psychology studies that have been going on for decades. So we share with them, for example, some basic points from the website and from the book Changeology. Now this might look like pop psychology, but it's written by John Norcross, who's one of the absolute towering researchers in the field, studying how people do things like quit smoking, lose weight and keep it off, engage in an exercise program when they're sedentary. And it turns out that the processes that govern success or failure in those stick-to-it situations, they tend to apply across all of them. So the same principles that govern being able to resist a cigarette when you're quitting smoking also apply when you're trying to start exercising when you haven't been, or you're changing your diet. So these things, I'm not going to list them for you. They're probably quite familiar. They're things like, have a very specific plan. What are you going to do when you're in a class and things get boring, or your students next to you start distracting you? Realizing that pretty much any behavior change plan involves some failure, that we backslide, we mess up, and we don't actually start at square one. That's what Norcross's research has revealed. So we share that with students too, and our parting thought to them in this Attention Matters course is, all right, what's your plan? And we have learned so much just from reading those discussions. I mean, even things that I can use in my own life. Things like, I'm going to use one browser when I'm, footsing around on social media, and I'm going to use another browser for my schoolwork. I have one person come through this and say, I have a Dropbox outside of my house. I'm going to put my phone in there when I'm studying. And if I want to be on it, I have to walk out and stand in the front yard. And it's cold in Flagstaff, and it snows. And so I'm like, yeah, I could really use that too. We ask them what to do when students around you are watching videos on their laptops or doing other distracting things. Are you going to engage with them? Are you going to move your seats? To me, it doesn't matter what the answer is so much as having the plan. So that's something that we can provide for students too, the missing piece that lets them put into practice those cognitive principles for learning that we've shared with them. So my closing thoughts to you are this. Here's what I want to highlight for you. So I really do believe that even our very strongest students want and need and deserve to have the best design learning activities we can make for them. They deserve to have mindful incorporation of technology if that's going to be a part of your course. And they also need and want and deserve to have the skills themselves to pull back that curtain and say, okay, here's how this works. You take this into the next course, into the next degree, into the rest of your life. So that's what's really going to equip them to be able to do that. And it's a big goal, but I think that we can get there. We can push towards that if we do bring together these different perspectives, the cognitive, the motivational, and then somewhere in between the self-regulated learning idea. And we look at those through the lens of our unique discipline and the students that we have and we're experienced in working with. And it also comes from laser focusing on technology to do the things that technology does well, to do things like present a simulation or a series of quiz questions, and to leave it out for things that it does not do well. And what does that look like in the end when we're reaching that grand vision? I think it looks like having lots of structured retrieval opportunities will help me build that base of knowledge. It looks like engaging in structured, well-designed, well-chosen, compelling simulations that let me practice those skills and make them transferable. And it definitely looks like having students be our partners so that we're all on the same side on this war against distraction and disengagement that's necessary, especially when technology is in the mix and phones are in hands, right? So that is how we can leverage this vast body of knowledge and the technologies that are freely available right now and do that in service of our very deserving students. Thank you very much. and we have time for questions, further comments. And just as before, always important to use the microphone for those reasons that I mentioned before. So I'll give you a moment to collect your thoughts, and then let's hear from you. Questions, comments. Okay, we have one right here. And then one right here.
I have a question about retrieval practice.
Yes.
You mentioned, for example, doing things like downloading test banks from textbooks onto your learning management system. I'm just wondering, in terms of the style of questions that you tend to get in test banks, which tend to not be very high bloom and not necessarily the sort of questions that you would have on an exam, how far away in style can the learning retrieval practice be from the sort of higher stakes exams that you're giving in order for it to be useful time for the students to use as a way of doing their learning?
Oh, and what a great question, especially if you do this, if you actually do the deep dive into the whole test bank. Oh my goodness, I mean, and I'm just going to be a little critical of publishers here for a moment. I mean, I think they got away for years with kind of having this bank that did contain a lot of very superficial questions and questions that were just wrong. And when we were going through and cherry picking and creating, you know, a high stakes exam out of them, who cares? But now the whole thing is being used for a learning activity. I mean, on a very practical standpoint, we've always really kind of in a broken record way foregrounded for students, this is part of the learning activity. Remember, this is repeatable. You keep your highest grade. You ran across a question that you thought was bad or poorly constructed, you know, take the quiz again, tell me about it later. But how far can it go? I'm not aware of any systematic work that kind of pinpoints the Bloom's taxonomy component of it and how far off that can be. However, I do think that whether we're going to be highly systematic about it or just intuitive, really looking at it and saying, does this map onto to what I'm using in this exam? If that's, you know, one of the big purposes of having a repeatable quiz activity, that is very important. So the style, the level, it should at least be roughly comparable. And here's where something like saying, well, some of these questions are going to actually show up on the exam. That also forces me, as far as being yet another little incentive for students to actually look at as many questions as possible. That also kind of forces me to say, yeah, these are reasonably comparable questions. Also with Kahoots, I mean, we write Kahoots. Kahoots have to be very short. That's just a constraint of how the system works. It's a good one. Those two, I find that it's very useful for me to say, okay, I will use, say, 3 of these on the real exam. That helps keep me in line with making sure that the topics, the level, the style are comparable. I mean, we also know in kind of the very applied memory research that what's called transfer appropriate processing is also important. So when we practice in a way that really mirrors the eventual assessment, that really helps drive our success. So if I can keep the format and so on consistent with the test, that should help in that sense. Now, from just the sense of developing the student's knowledge, any kind of practice they're doing is again probably superior to totally unstructured review-oriented practice on their own. So I don't want us to take from this, oh my gosh, that sounds kind of difficult, or there could be problems, maybe I won't do it. I think some is better than none. If there's one thing that comes out of sort of the story of this research, it's just how bomb-proof the retrieval practice phenomenon is. But that is definitely, you've identified something we should be mindful of in a very practical way when we look to incorporate this into our courses. Yeah, and we have another. Oh, wait, here we go first, and then over here.
Hi, thanks. I actually have 2 questions.
Yes.
One is, does retrieval practice change with age groups? So we brought up lifetime learning. We're talking, I'm presuming, mostly about college students. I'm also curious about the K through 12 level. And the other question is, so we do engineering education, which is very applied, and a lot of it is very hands-on.
Yeah.
Does that count as retrieval practice when you're using or applying what you're learning, or is it really the quizzing and retrieving specific pieces of information that you're teaching and learning?
All right, so two great questions. First of all, I may have to punt a little on K through 12, and that this is one where I do like to kind of stay in my lane. And it's not like, you know, a switch flips when we're 18 and we think differently, but there are some more gradual changes. There is some good research, though, I know of in middle schools in particular. So some of the people working in this area are specifically working in you know, those grades, middle school, also up to high school, and have seen some really interesting results. There's one study in particular I'm thinking of where they looked not just at the academic achievement that went along with bringing more retrieval practice into a course, but also anxiety levels. So test anxiety. And that's maybe a little, you know, it seems a little counterintuitive, but by having more kind of relaxed, low stakes opportunities for testing, they found that it brought that down as well. So, you know, yes, that is going on at that level. You know, younger than that, I have to say I'm not sure. Now, I would say that, yes, if we do stay focused on that idea of effortful retrieval and we set the learning conditions up to ensure that, then yes, that's retrieval practice too. And I'll throw out a favorite example that is also in the book Minds Online when I worked with an engineering professor, electrical engineering, some time ago. And she was looking at reinforcing how students can use these basic principles like Ohm's law in circuit analysis courses. And that was her idea, is like, wow, students, you know, they're trying to skip ahead and they're missing these foundational points. And we put together homework that, while it wasn't a quiz exactly, it was timed in a way, and you actually were incentivized in that homework to do these problems quickly as well as accurately. These problems would reinforce whatever the given principle is, like Ohm's law. So you're seeing different variations on the same problem. Well, that is retrieval practice because students are not running and opening the book and saying, okay, let me use that and kind of type it in here. And that was her big, you know, the aha moment when I was working with her. She said, yeah, students can look up Ohm's law and I have this argument with them, but you're not going to last as an electrical engineer if you have to do that. So if it has that quality, that instead of, you know, working out of a book or reviewing or something like that, that I'm taking that foundational stuff and I'm effortfully pulling it out and applying it, then yeah, that's retrieval practice too. It doesn't have to look and feel like a test to have retrieval practice be a big part of it. Great, and I think another question.
Hi, I wanted to ask about something that I think is kind of a troubling trend in higher education, which is that as the cost of higher education goes up and up, that it promotes something like a sort of customer mindset in students, that they therefore feel that because of the amount they're paying, that their role in the educational process kind of begins and ends with that payment. Yeah. So I'm curious as to whether you think that your insights on motivation, et cetera, can tell us something about how to combat that sort of customer service mentality that's kind of taking over higher education. Yeah.
And I would like to, you know, I'd like to see, there's a little bit of work out there on that, but I hope that researchers do tackle that in more depth. Now, two things. I think perhaps just like with attention and distraction, bringing down that barrier between them and us, and making it a two-way conversation to say, you know, hey, this is a mentality. What do you all think of this mentality? Or using an old psychologist trick, which is getting them to endorse what you want them to believe. So I could start out and say, hey, I have an introductory assignment in this course, no matter what it is, that says, you know, let's all maybe query or interrogate this belief that when you pay for an education, here's what you get. Or actually just yesterday, I'm kicking off one of my online courses with perhaps a variation on the same idea. I'm asking my students to talk about, in the introduction discussion forum, the saying that the person who does the work gets the learning. The prior instructor had said, you know, I had all these issues with academic honesty and I feel like students were just swapping work, and, you know, there's lots of ways to come at that. And I'm doing some of those as well, but I'm going to see what happens by having this open-ended discussion where I say, oh, wow, you know, the person who does the work gets the learning, and that's hard to disagree with, so we're all going to agree. Oh, explain that to me. And so they have an opportunity to have a voice there and start to adopt that belief authentically as their own. So yes, I think that if students really do truly have that belief that my parents or the state or whoever put the money down, I'm going to come here, breathe the air, and you give me a grade at the end. If that's really where they're at, yeah, that is a great case. If we can design learning environments for the rest of our career, and it's not going to make a lot of difference, because that is going to be very pernicious to learning. But those are some of the ways that we could perhaps come at that from this idea of values, shared purpose with our students as well. We can also, I think, tap into the transparency concept here as well. We can talk about, all right, so why is it? Why are we learning Ohm's Law? You know, is it to make me happy? Why are we doing this? Think about the real people who are going to be on the other end of your work when you're done. Let's focus on them for a minute. And then I think something as superficial as the customer mentality tends to go away. But that is one that it's hard to talk about, and it's hard to talk about sometimes in a respectful and productive way, I find, for myself, because it's so upsetting. But I think if we come at it from these kind of novel and creative ways, and through dialogue with our students, that could be a way to come at that. Does that help? And may I ask what you're teaching? And I'll repeat it.
I previously taught the freshman science course here at Formative.
Freshman science courses. Okay, all right, yeah, I can see there's going to be a lot of challenges there. All right, good, and we have another. Oh, sorry.
This is just a follow-up on that, because I think it's a really, really important point.
Yeah.
And I've been working, I'm a staff member here, and I've been working in the co-curricular space. Mm-hmm. And what we've been finding, thinking about learning transfer, is that students are the greatest opportunity we're finding is after they've finished an assignment. After they've gotten past getting the grade, which has been their sort of driving focus, then there's an opportunity for us to leverage their learning, to remind them of what they've learned, and then to provide activities that help them to leverage that learning in a completely different setting. And in particular, what we're doing is students are terrified by interviewing for jobs. Okay. So we use that to help them develop interview techniques in which they can really own their learning. They have to own their learning to do well in these interviews, essentially. And that's an extremely, extremely difficult thing for any of us, really, to do. Yeah. But we've found by accident that that's when they seem to be most receptive to relearning or reinforcing their learning and being able to use it and take it somewhere else.
Our minds are set up not to take in disjointed information that might be useful someday. We're set up to take in what's relevant to us right now. I mean, in fact, there's even, to make a kind of a distant analogy to something else from memory research, there is one exception to when reviewing, rereading the textbook is helpful for memory, and that is when you just missed a test question on it. It does create this receptive window. And what I'd like everybody to think about, too, is this idea of relevance. I mean, we've been kicking around for so many years, we'll make assignments relevant to students' lives. And I think that can easily devolve into, well, let's talk about Pokemon or pop culture or something. Students are not all about pop culture. They are thinking about things like, I'm going to need to be interviewing. What is that even like? And that's going to be happening sooner rather than later. So you've got something compelling, you're simulating a process that's important to them, and you are hooking that into the real world. Now I really am motivated to go back and ask. Last question? Here we go.
Thank you for an excellent talk.
Oh, thank you.
Some of our students, when we talk about the importance of attention and shutting off their electronic device for other than class purposes, say it makes them more anxious, less able to learn. So what do you think about the idea of pairing the attention app, or course, which you said someone gives extra credit for, with a combination of having students at the outset self-monitor and then so do it on an individual basis, because some kids have a much more difficult time, and over the time of the course give 2 to 3 points towards their final grade for anyone who's, reduced the distractions in their setting.
Oh, perfect. So the idea is, let's build into the course a simple, that's straight out of applied behavior, intentional behavior change research. Track it. Have a goal. Instead of just saying, oh, I'm never going to do X, Y, or Z again, have a goal. And I think that this would work really well, especially with going into it with that mindset of like, I'm here, instead of like, I'm here doling out points for you to do this thing, of, okay, we're all in this together, and really, and perhaps also coupling it with an opportunity, at least briefly, for students to offer their thoughts. It's surprising, to the point of being shocking sometimes, about how so-called digital native students, stereotyped as being, I have to have technology, some of them do feel anxious. What your comment also reminds me of what some students have shared with me about being grounded in high school and having their phone taken away for 2 days. Some felt anxious, some felt relieved. It can be very individual. As long as it's voluntary, kind of co-consensual and co-created, I think that could be very, very powerful. And right at the end of the course, we could revisit that and say, well, what did you notice happened? How did you feel? What surprised you when you did work up to being able to put down your phone and be anxious? And to say it's nothing to be ashamed of. I feel anxious too when I don't have access to my devices. But if I take a breath and work up to it for a certain purpose, I find that it's very helpful in these ways. Would you like to join me in that? So with that, what a great practical, applied idea that brings together the cognitive and the motivational. So thank you very much.